Hello, 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 and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses that wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. Okay, so we're into a new year, just trying to get back in a groove here, and I figured I'd record a quick podcast checking in from the first week of the Florida Legislature, of committee meetings ahead of the Florida Legislature's 2025 legislative session. And for folks that don't know, the Florida Legislature typically has a 60-day session every year. That's when it can actually pass bills into law. But the idea that they're only up there for 60 days is kind of a joke, because they do a bunch of like what are often called committee meetings, committee weeks in advance, where they essentially are doing a lot of advance work. They're working on bills. They're having discussions and debates and stuff like that. For all intents and purposes, they're already in session. It's just they can't pass bills yet. And these committee weeks are often very interesting. You get some, the early ones give you some insights into what might be coming, some of the issues that are most important to legislative leadership, which matters in a place like Tallahassee, which is essentially a top-down run institution where, I'm quoting from a Republican legislator who said this week, that 95% of the lawmaking power in Florida is in the hands of three individuals: the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the Governor. So anyway, I thought I'd check in and just sort of talk through some of the stuff that I thought was interesting from this past week, some of the stuff that jumped out at me. I'm not working off a script here, so apologies in advance for all the ahs and here. I've just got a couple of bullet points of things that I want to go through. And I guess we'll start with what I think is pretty obviously the biggest and most interesting story of this week, and that is Governor Ron DeSantis trying to strong-arm the Florida Legislature into a special session before the regular session begins to work on a few big issues that he wants that are important to him and that he wants to make a big deal. And even more so than that, the sort of surprising resistance we saw from the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, who are both Republicans as well, pushing back against Ron DeSantis in a way that we have not seen in years in Florida, certainly not since COVID. Ron DeSantis turned around, went running to Donald Trump, sort of got daddy involved to come to his side, take his side in this little spat. So it does seem like, I don't know if there's been any formal announcement yet, but it does seem like this special session is probably going to happen. But, just the fact that Florida lawmakers are willing to push back in such a publicly and aggressive ways it certainly shows that the dynamic is shifting in Tallahassee, and this year is likely to look a little different than the last few years, certainly. Whether that means anything for, the working people of Florida, I'm not so sure how much that impacts things, but it's at least interesting to see some level of backbone in the legislature and some sign that there's going to be a little bit of back and forth rather than just a rubber stamping of whatever this governor wants to do. And so with the special session, most of the focus has been on immigration, because that's where Ron DeSantis wants the focus to be. That's what he's been talking about the most, trying to sort of marry it to Donald Trump's ascension in Washington, his inauguration in Washington, and sort of glom onto sort of all the attention illegal immigration is about to get. But I would argue that the bigger issue here in what Ron DeSantis wants to do is all the changes he wants to make on ballot initiatives and petition drives, basically the citizen process to amend the state constitution in Florida. This is a big part of what this special session would do if it goes according to Ron DeSantis's wishes. And he's got some pretty genuinely wild ideas, including essentially making it a felony to collect petitions. The obvious context here is this is coming out of a campaign in which, there were a couple of ballot initiatives that Ron DeSantis personally opposed, one that would have overturned the state's abortion ban, one that would have legalized marijuana. Both of them got strong majorities. It was more than 57% for abortion rights. It was 55, 56%, something like that for legal marijuana, but they fell short of this 60% requirement in the Florida Constitution. Ron DeSantis wants to stop anything like that from happening again. And that's a big push here. And you have to remember, this isn't just about abortion and marijuana. The citizen initiative process, this is how Floridians have been able to, raise the minimum wage, force the Florida legislature to spend more money and put more focus into, land conservation and setting aside habitat for wildlife and for, outdoor recreation, that sort of thing. There is a ballot initiative that has begun that would expand health insurance in Florida. These sorts of changes would explicitly attack that stuff and make it, very much harder. It's already very, very hard, but it would make it even much harder. Arguably, in the case of abortion, and I'll explain that in just a sec, make it impossible to amend the Constitution in the future, at least via petition drives. The Florida legislature can still do whatever it wants. It can put whatever it wants on the ballot. And all they're trying to do is stop citizens from going around this, incredibly gerrymandered and extreme body in Tallahassee. Now, one piece of this that I think is really interesting, and I posted a thread on this on Blue Sky this morning. There is a piece in here that seems specifically targeted at any future abortion rights amendment in terms of petition drive, in terms of making sure it can't get on the ballot at all, like to permanently prevent any sort of attempt to overturn the state's abortion ban or provide any sort of abortion access into the Florida Constitution. I don't want to go too deep into the weeds in this podcast, so I'll throw a link to that thread that goes into it, but it involves what's known as the Basic Rights Clause of the Constitution, and it's essentially teeing up the Florida Supreme Court to rule that fetuses and zygotes are people are human beings, are living people under the Florida Constitution, and in doing so have rights that would effectively give the court the ammunition to prevent any kind of abortion rights ballot measure from ever even appearing on the ballot. So that is a really significant change, and it goes directly to abortion rights. I mean, you can make a pretty compelling case that this special session will be an abortion ban special session because of this piece. Again, maybe Florida lawmakers look at 57% of the voters of the state wanting to overturn this abortion ban and decide not to take up that piece. Obviously, something to keep an eye on. Okay, so as for the committee hearings themselves, there are a bunch this week. I'll just run through a couple that jumped out at me. The most interesting for my money, and we ended up writing a story about this on the newsletter. I'll post a link to that in the show notes too. And this was an update in the Senate Ethics and Elections Committee, an update on the implementation of a bill, just an absolutely awful bill that Governor Ron DeSantis and the legislature passed last year that essentially gut the state's ethics laws. And if you paid attention last session, you may be familiar with this bill, or maybe it'll ring a bell, but this was a piece of legislation that essentially hobbled the state Florida Commission on Ethics. That's the agency that investigates allegations of corruption among public officials. And what it did was it imposed new barriers to what the agency can investigate. Specifically, it said the agency can only investigate complaints that are based on personal knowledge or information other than hearsay. And, one of the big effects of making that change is that you are effectively blocking the commission from taking any action on complaints that are based on, like, newspaper investigations, for instance, which are, media reports are one of the most common sources of prompting ethics complaints. This new law, among many other things it did that were pretty awful, it prevents the Florida Commission on Ethics on investigating complaints based on, like, news reports. And so that was bad enough. And it was done in, it was done in a really, like, shady way. The Florida Senate sort of sat on this idea and didn't introduce it until, like, very late in the process, when it was too late for anybody from the public to testify against it or in a hearing or ask lawmakers questions about it. But it turns out, we learned this week that it's even worse than we thought. And that's because the Florida Commission on Ethics staffers have decided that this new law it doesn't only sort of prohibit limit future ethics complaints. It also applies to a whole bunch of complaints that have already been filed and the commission is already investigating. It's retroactive, even in cases where the Ethics Commission has already found probable cause that a public official has violated ethics laws. If it turns out, if they go back through their files and find out that this complaint was based on, wasn't based on personal information or personal knowledge or information other than hearsay, they're going to start dismissing these complaints, and they've already begun doing so. They dismissed one complaint at their last meeting involving. I'm going off the top of my head again. There's a story in the show notes that you can read more details, but involved like a local water district supervisor who was accused of essentially using district employees and property for personal use. They're getting ready to dismiss some of the allegations against State Rep Randy Fine now. Yeah, you probably know Randy Fine. He's kind of like the sort of Matt Gaetz 2.0 of Florida. I mean that in the sort of incendiary, bombastic, over the top media thirsty way, not some of the other ways that Matt Gaetz might be interpreted. But anyway, they're getting ready to potentially dismiss some of the allegations against him because of this complaint that they'd already found probable cause on, because of this change that the legislature and Ron DeSantis made last year. So that's really bad. That's, Florida's ethics laws are already like notoriously lax. And so the fact that they passed a law last year weakening them even further was bad. The fact that it's now retroactive, they're dissolving cases that were already underway, really bad. If there's any silver lining here, is that the legislature does have some options to kind of blunt some of this damage on the off chance that there are people in Tallahassee that would like to actually strengthen ethics laws. The Florida Commission on Ethics has, for a number of years now, been pitching an idea of giving whistleblower legal protections to people who file valid complaints. So making sure like a state employee or a state contractor who comes forward and files a complaint that proves to be valid can't be retaliated against by the politician that employs them by a demotion or a pay cut or getting fired, that sort of thing. The legislature has kind of ignored this idea for a number of years, but I would argue that they should take another look at it right now, because it's even more important. If we're going to severely limit who can file ethics complaints, then it is really important that we make sure we protect the folks that can. Let me say that a different way. The legislature insisted, as it passed this Senate Bill 7014 last year, that what it was trying to do was ensure that the Ethics Commission wasn't wasting its time on frivolous complaints filed by people just basing it off of rumor and innuendo, and instead was focused on serious and substantive complaints that were based on like detailed fact-based knowledge, right? If that's true, if that was really the reason, then it follows that you should also want to make sure you are protecting and encouraging the people that have that personal knowledge, that have that detailed and fact-based information that can file substantive complaints. You should make sure you want to protect them so that they feel comfortable coming forward and filing these complaints that the Ethics Commission can now act upon. So, who knows what we'll see. Bills are just beginning to get filed for the session, but hopefully maybe the legislature takes a second look at legal protections for people that file ethics complaints now that we've essentially severely limited who can file them to begin with. Okay, so another thing from last week that I thought was really interesting. There was a discussion in, I think it was the House committee that oversees the transportation part of the state budget. There was a long, really interesting conversation about the need to strengthen Florida's aggregates supply chain. Aggregates is basically the material that gets used to build roads. I think it's the material that goes into asphalt, although I don't know if there's like some, technicality I'm missing there, but it's essentially the material that gets used to build roads. And there was a lot of discussion about the need to sort of improve, protect, strengthen, and expand the aggregate supply chain so there's not a shortage of that material that would slow road building projects. It's an interesting discussion all on its own. Like, this is kind of like the nuts and bolts of how you make government work that, I just personally find interesting. But what stood out to me is there's like a couple of really like controversial things lurking in the background from involving some of the biggest businesses in Florida that all kind of that aggregates could ultimately be used as kind of a fig leaf to get some of this stuff going. And I'm thinking specifically of Florida's big sugar companies. U.S. Sugar Corp and Florida Crystals are right now working on some plans for what would be essentially a rock mine in south of Lake Okeechobee, basically in the historic Everglades, but on former sort of, or I'm not sure if it's former or current sugarcane land right now. And they're pitching this project as eventually a water storage project for the Everglades and for Lake Okeechobee. But it is first before it is that it's a rock mine, and they're planning to use this rock mine, at least some of the material from it, to sell it as aggregate to the Florida Department of Transportation. So you could very well see the legislature doing something to try and help that project along, whether that's tying the hands of locals who might have to vote on this project or providing some sort of state funding for it, all under the guise of like promoting the aggregate supply chain. And the other place is we've talked a bit in the past about Mosaic, the giant phosphate miner and fertilizer manufacturer. It strip mines huge swaths of South Central Florida, the heartland part of the state, and it turns all of that phosphate rock into fertilizer at these chemical factories. There's one in Bartow, I believe. It's one of the bigger ones. And that process, that fertilizer manufacturing process, creates this toxic byproduct called phosphogypsum. It's mildly radioactive, and it gets right now you can't do anything with it because of that radioactivity, and it ends up getting piled in these giant man-made mountains called gyp stacks. There has been, you may recall, I think 2 sessions ago, there was a big fight over the radioactive roads bill where Mosaic and the phosphate industry generally, although the phosphate industry in Florida is predominantly Mosaic, which is one of the world's biggest companies. It wants the ability to use this phosphogypsum for aggregate as road building material. And so it wouldn't surprise me if in the guise of is part of this broader conversation around aggregates that you see some sort of movement in the legislature to trying to keep pushing in that direction, particularly with the Trump administration coming in, where I think one of the things a lot of folks are expecting is the EPA to relax rules on what can be done with phosphogypsum to allow it to be used as aggregate. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see some push around there. And also, the Mosaic and the fertilizer and the phosphate industry have also been pushing to sort of turn phosphogypsum, these gyp stacks, into sort of resources for critical minerals that you can like pull out from some of the metals and the rare earth minerals and metals that are used in like electric car batteries, electronics, that sort of thing. There are quite a bit of those in these gyp stacks, and they're working on these ideas where you could extract that. It wouldn't surprise me if we see a big push for some sort of state subsidies around that, whether that's putting a bunch of state money, taxpayer money into research, or tax breaks for companies that do this kind of work. And again, all of this, the fact that aggregates sort of ties into all this made me really perk up at this in-depth discussion of aggregates in this House committee. So anyway, aggregates, keep that in mind as we move closer and closer to the legislative session. Just a couple other things that were sort of on my mind. There were a couple of really interesting hearings on property insurance. Of course, still probably the dominant economic issue in Florida. Doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. Rates are still rising despite sort of passing basically every change the insurance industry has asked for the last few years. The pace of the increases has slowed way down. So you're listening to legislators trying to make the case that, look, we've stabilized rates, even though rates haven't come down in any meaningful way and again, continue to rise. The South Florida Sun Sentinel just had another piece about that was really analyzing the data. I'll throw that into the show notes as well. But in these discussions about insurance, the two things that jumped out at me, one was several legislators ended up expressing quite a bit of frustration around something I'm actually thinking about writing a story about this. I'm working on it right now, but kind of trying to decide exactly how I want to frame it up and what exactly I want to say about it. But around the secrecy in the property insurance industry and the way they essentially use exemptions, public records exemptions for trade secrets to essentially hide all of their information and make it virtually impossible for anybody outside the industry to check their claims, to look at their, check their work, to make sure what they're saying adds up. And like one of the examples I come back to, and we had a story this summer over looking at the ways insurance companies are using all these internal transactions. They create a bunch of corporate affiliates and then they pay them for services. You'll pay them for claims processing. You'll borrow money from one and pay interest to it, that sort of thing. Exactly the same sorts of strategies that corporations devise to dodge corporate income taxes. Insurance companies are also using in a way that can allow them to dodge what are supposed to be limits on how much profits an insurance company can earn. This is a regulated industry. You're not supposed to earn excessive profits, but these transactions can allow insurance companies to essentially move money out of their regulated business and into these unregulated affiliates where there aren't limits on profitability. And I remember being amazed that, you could look at an insurance company and you can't just tell from the public materials whether it turned a profit last year. It'll say on paper maybe that it lost money, but you can't then go look at all its unregulated affiliates and see how they did. They're all ultimately owned by the same shareholders, right? And so one of the challenges here is because all of these agreements that they have with these affiliates and stuff, insurance companies will label as trade secrets. And this shows up in lots of different ways. Like I believe you can't even find out in Florida right now if you want to know like how many policies State Farm, for instance, writes in your county. State Farm considers that a trade secret. So that's redacted and not released from all the documents it files with the state. And you started to see a number of legislators expressing frustration around that. And that's encouraging to me in a couple of ways. One, it does suggest that there are a number of legislators that are at least trying to like check the insurance industry's work. There's this cliche saying in journalism, like if your mom says she loves you, check it out, right? Like trust but verify is another way to say that. And so that at least suggests to me that some legislators are trying to verify some of what they're being told by the insurance industry, and they're clanging into these trade secrets exemptions, and they're getting frustrated because there is no way to check it. The insurance office, the insurance commissioner, they get access to this stuff. And the insurance industry, the Office of Insurance and Regulation right now is run by a guy that I actually think has done some pretty good things. We had a podcast about that not too terribly long ago, last summer, I think. And so it's a guy who I think I generally trust to be at least somewhat pro-consumer, far more than most legislators. But we can't check his work. Like he shouldn't have like the power of God be the only one that can verify this stuff, right? We should want this stuff. We should want as much transparency as possible in this stuff. And so maybe you will see some legislation coming that tries to reel in the insurance industry's use of trade secrets exemptions. That's not going to have any direct impact on rates, but at least we can start getting some definitive answers and building some trust in this space. And if it turns out that for instance, insurance companies really are aggressively banking excessive profits in subsidiaries, we can start to get to the bottom of some of that stuff and reel that kind of behavior back in. The other thing that kind of like made my ears prick up in one of these insurance discussions is the conversation turned to reinsurance. And just as an aside, there was a moment where a sitting legislator asked the insurance commissioner to explain what reinsurance is, which is just sort of maddening because, the Florida legislature has been debating reinsurance issues for, I shit you not, 2 decades now. This is a thing I was learning about in 2007, as early as 2007. And the idea that there are still legislators out there that don't even know what reinsurance is and how it works in Florida, particularly in the context of insurance policy after all of these years, it's a window into how term limits does not solve any problems. It creates different problems, right? The idea that people instinctively support term limits because it sounds good, like you want to get like fresh faces and get old fat cats out of there. But the problem is you end up with just a constant cycle of essentially rookie legislators who don't have time, who don't have the knowledge base to sort of go toe to toe with insurance industry lobbyists on these kinds of policies. And again, you layer that in with those trade secrets exemptions where even the legislators who spend the time, who try and figure this stuff out, they clang into all these exemptions that stop them from getting the information they need to come to real decisions. Anyway, I got sidetracked there. In this discussion around reinsurance, the insurance commissioner kind of alluded to the California wildfires and the sort of impact that could have in Florida. The thing about reinsurance, and for folks that, who are listening who are not familiar with reinsurance, which is utterly acceptable. If you're not in the Florida legislature, it's completely acceptable to me that you would not know what reinsurance is. But this is essentially insurance that insurance companies buy for themselves to protect themselves against catastrophic events that will fuel a bunch of claims at once, like a hurricane, like wildfires, that sort of thing. And reinsurance is affected by like global factors. So the insurance commissioner kind of alluded that there's a decent chance that these wildfires in California are going to send reinsurance rates rising even further again, just as he said, they seemed to be stabilizing a little bit after the last few years. So we could be looking at another round of insurance companies coming looking for rate because reinsurance is going back up because of these wildfires. So just a thing to keep an eye on too, and reinsurance is a major factor. I think what you heard in some of these hearings that between 30 and 50% of the premium on a typical homeowner's insurance policy is going to cover the cost of reinsurance. So it's a major driver of the price of insurance in Florida. Okay, just quickly, a few other things to keep in mind. Bills are now being filed. I wanted to flag one in particular. This is House Bill 173 that was just filed, and it's the first of what I think we're going to see several banking industry-backed bills that are designed to essentially cut funding for legal aid, which if you're not familiar with legal aid, this is just this critically important program that ensures everybody has fair access to courts. This is a program that helps veterans make sure they have lawyers who can help them get benefits they're entitled to. It helps victims of domestic violence who are trying to divorce their partners make sure they don't lose custody of their children in those cases, that sort of thing. It is a program. I don't want to dive too deeply into the weeds. This is another thing. We actually wrote a pretty in-depth story about this not too long ago. I will post that in the show notes as well. But this is going to be a big fight. The banking industry essentially is pissed off that it has to pay more money to fund this program after quite literally decades of underfunding this program and skating by on funding it at like minimal levels. This is a really bad bill. I think you're going to see a bunch of politicians whose priorities, who they really care about here. One of the guys that has gotten involved at the banking industry's side of this has been Jimmy Patronis, the state's chief financial officer guy running for Matt Gaetz's congressional seat right now. I think you're going to see a bunch of other politicians trying to cozy up to the banking industry by getting involved with this. So that'll be a big fight this session, I suspect, and it'll be one we'll be paying close attention to. And it speaks to this issue I talk a lot about everybody's going to be screaming about immigration. Everybody's going to be screaming about, I expect there'll be more big abortion fights and all those. I don't mean to minimize those are all important, but all that happens, you've got, banking industry lobbyists running around with this stuff that nobody understands that essentially will hurt lots of people if they get their way, if they pass this. It's called IOTA, which stands for interest on trust account. So if you ever come across the phrase IOTA, have your ears perk up, pay attention, because it's probably pretty important, even though it might sound like Greek. And finally, I guess we should probably mention Ron DeSantis just appointed Ashley Moody, the state's attorney general, near the end of the week to fill the U.S. Senate vacancy created by Donald Trump appointing Marco Rubio Secretary of State. Honestly, to my mind, the bigger story here is that Ron DeSantis then turned around and appointed his chief of staff, a guy by the name of James Meyer, I think is how you pronounce it, appointed him to be the attorney general. That's a really interesting thing for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of ensures that one of the few remaining people in Florida whose loyalty is presumably to Ron DeSantis rather than Donald Trump puts that guy in a position of enormous power, essentially the state's top lawyer. This is also a guy who, by a lot of accounts appears to be like a true zealot and fundamentalist, and a guy who like will weaponize government against people he disagrees with. And I base that in part on a story we wrote a while back about his work with banking industry lobbyists about a different issue. So I'll throw that story into the show notes if anyone wants to read a little bit more about that tale as well. Okay, I think we'll cut it off right there. I'll probably do this again next week because the legislature's going back, and then probably do it again for a special session. As always, if you haven't already, please think about signing up for the newsletter. Easiest way to find us is at SeekingRentsFL.com. Subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts are ever behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. If you've got the means, please think about doing that. Those voluntary paid subscriptions are super important to helping us cover reporting expenses like the cost of public records requests, that sort of thing. If you're watching this on YouTube, click like and subscribe. You leave any comments that you have. And then if there are any issues you want us diving into, if there are bills you care about, there are questions you have about the legislature, my email address will be in the show notes as well, but it's garcia.jason@gmail.com. Please email me with questions, comments, suggestions, whatever. Happy to do what I can to sort of spread the word about what Florida's elected leaders are really doing and who they are actually helping in Tallahassee. So, okay, we'll leave it there and we'll talk again soon. Take care.